There are certain moments in a person's life when the world seems to tilt just slightly at first, as though giving a quiet warning before everything begins to slide in a direction you never asked for. For Michael Grant, that moment happened 8 years earlier on a night when rain washed over the Nevada desert and the sound of sirens carried across the dark like a terrible omen. He had been a man of the open road, once known for building motorcycles that seemed to whisper stories of highways and faraway towns. His leather vest bore the marks of long journeys, and his brothers in the Silver Ravens riding circle were the kind of men who showed up at sunrise or midnight if you needed a hand. The road was his compass, and the rumble of an engine was the closest thing he had to a heartbeat. But all that changed the night Emily was taken from him. She had been driving home from her sister's house, barely a few miles from their front porch, when a speeding pickup ran a red light and sent her small car spinning into darkness. The driver never stopped. He vanished into the night, leaving behind a shattered taillight, a crushed fender, and a young mother whose gentle laugh would never again fill their kitchen. When Michael stood beside her hospital bed and felt her hand grow still and something inside him folded in on itself. There are losses that bruise a man, and then there are losses that remake him entirely. Emily's passing did the latter. Their daughter Lily was only 3 then, a small girl with warm brown eyes and curls that refused to stay in place no matter how carefully Emily had brushed them. She clung to Michael in those first days as though she sensed the world had shifted into something unfamiliar. When she whimpered at night, reaching for a mother who would never answer, Michael made a promise he would repeat silently for years. He would carry her forward. He would build a new life for her, even if the pieces of his own life no longer fit the way they once had. He sold the custom motorcycles he had spent years perfecting, machines that held bits of his identity in their polished frames. Friends from the Silver Ravens tried to talk him out of it, but they understood. Brotherhood, real brotherhood, is built on more than shared miles. It is built on knowing when to let a man choose the road he needs, even if it leads away from you. Michael hung up his vest, folded it carefully, and tucked it into a box he never opened again. In the years that followed, every part of his life bent itself toward Lily. He learned to braid her hair, though the first few attempts left her looking more like a windswept bird than a tidy schoolgirl. He read picture books in a voice gentler than the one he used to use around campfires. He packed lunches with bright fruit slices arranged in careful little rows because she liked when things looked cheerful. Life grew smaller but also quieter in a way that surprised him. Evenings were spent in their modest kitchen with a pot simmering on the stove, and mornings began with Lily's small footsteps padding across the floor before she climbed into his lap, warm and sleepy. Still, there was always a space in the house that felt like a reminder of what had been lost. Some nights, when the world felt too heavy, Michael would stand at the edge of his garage staring at his tools, feeling the ghost of his old life lingering in the air. Yet every time Lily called his name in that soft voice of hers, he stepped back into the present without regret. By the time Lily turned 8, she was a thoughtful, artistic child who loved sketching flowers, birds, and imaginary places where the world felt calm and gentle. Michael believed she was finally stepping into a season of happiness again. He thought the worst storms had passed and they were building something steady, something safe. He could not have known that danger would come quietly slipping, not from a dark road or a reckless stranger, but from a place he trusted. He could not have known that the next great test of his life would begin with the simple sight of his daughter tightening her fingers around the strap of her backpack each morning, her small shoulders drawn just a bit too tight. He did not yet see the fear she tried to hide. He only saw his little girl growing, and he didn't know that the world was about to tilt once more. The change in Lily began so quietly that Michael almost missed it. Children grow, their moods ebb and flow, and sometimes a tired morning or a quiet afternoon seems like nothing more than the natural rhythm of childhood. At first he thought that was all it was. Just a phase. Just a little girl adjusting to a new grade, a new teacher, a new room full of voices and expectations. Yet something in her eyes began to shift. A dimming, almost like the soft glow she carried, had lowered itself without warning. Every morning she sat at the kitchen table with her cereal turning soft, pushing the spoon around as though breakfast were a task too heavy for her small hands. Her gaze stayed low, fixed on some distant place only she could see. When he asked about school, she gave answers so short they felt like whispers. Fine. Okay. I guess. And always with that same downward look, as though she feared saying too much or feared something waiting outside those doors. Michael noticed how she paused before putting on her backpack, fingers brushing the fabric as if she wished it belonged to another child in another story. He noticed how she flinched when he dropped a fork by accident or closed a cabinet a little too quickly. She had never been jumpy, not even in the hard years after Emily passed. She had always been cautious, but brave, gentle, but sturdy in her own quiet way. Seeing fear plant itself inside her was like watching frost creep across a window you thought was sealed. He asked Rosa, their neighbor and longtime friend who often watched Lily in the afternoons, if she had seen anything concerning. Rosa, with her warm laugh and silvering hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, shook her head and said, "Lily seemed polite and helpful, just a bit tired now and then. Nothing that suggested something was wrong." And Michael wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe Lily was simply settling into the early weeks of school, perhaps feeling the weight of new routines. Still, a father's heart has its own instincts shaped not by logic, but by love and the unspoken knowledge that children often hide what hurts them most. Some nights he found Lily sitting just inside her bedroom doorway, instead of tucked beneath her blanket. She held her stuffed rabbit close, her cheek pressed against its worn fur. When he asked why she wasn't in bed, she only said she felt better near the door, as though she needed to stay alert. One evening, as he tucked her in, Lily hesitated, seeming to search for words. She opened her mouth, closed it, then turned her face toward the window. He waited, giving her space, but the words never came. She simply whispered goodnight and pulled the covers up to her chin. Michael sat on the edge of his own bed that night, feeling a weight settle in his chest. He thought about Emily, about the strength she carried in her smile, and how she had always known how to draw Lily out of her shell. He wished she were there to tell him what he couldn't quite name yet. By the end of that month, even their Sunday walks along the old creek trail had changed. Lily no longer skipped ahead searching for smooth stones or bright leaves. Instead, she stayed close, watching the path behind them more often than the one in front. She carried herself like a child, waiting for something she didn't want to face. Michael told himself he would get answers. He would find the root of whatever shadow had crept into his daughter's world. But he had no idea how soon that moment would come. No idea that within a week he would step through the school's hallway at the wrong right time and see the truth laid bare like a wound that had been hidden for far too long. The Thursday it happened began like any other day, the sort of quiet morning where the sun rose with a soft golden haze that made the whole town of Cedar Glen look peaceful. Michael had planned to finish work early so he could surprise Lily by picking her up before dismissal. He imagined the way her face might brighten when she saw him waiting in the hallway. For days he had been thinking that maybe a small gesture like that could help soothe whatever had been troubling her. A simple moment of comfort in a world that suddenly felt too heavy for an 8-year-old child. He arrived at Willow Creek Academy earlier than usual, parked his old truck beneath a maple tree, still holding on to the last of its green leaves, and walked toward the front entrance with a sense of purpose. The halls inside were quiet, the way schools often are when classes are still in session. His boots echoed gently against the polished floor as he climbed the stairs toward the second floor, expecting nothing more than a glimpse of his daughter, carefully packing her notebooks. But the moment he stepped into the hallway, the world stopped moving. At the far end of the corridor, Lily stood backed up against the pale green wall. Her small hands were raised slightly at her sides, her shoulders trembling with the kind of fear no child should ever feel in a place meant to keep them safe. Tear tracks streaked her cheeks, leaving faint, dry trails that said this had been happening long before he walked in. Standing over her was Mrs. Helen Marbury, a woman in her 40s whose tight bun and crisp blouse gave the impression of someone who prized strictness above all else. Her voice cut through the empty hallway with a cold sharpness that made the air feel thinner. "Say it again. You know the words." Lily's voice was barely a whisper. "I am slow. I must do better." Michael froze in place, unable to breathe for a moment. His eyes swept over the scene with quick, practiced precision, the kind he had learned during his years on the road when danger sometimes announced itself without warning. Lily's lunchbox lay open across the tiles, its contents crushed. The sandwich flattened, the fruit, bruised the juice packet broken and leaking down the inside of the plastic lid. Her sweater sleeve had slipped back, revealing red marks on her wrist. Finger marks. A grip so tight it had left a painful reminder. A heat rose in his chest, the sort of heat a man tries to tame when he chooses peace over the person he used to be. But instinct, especially when tied to the heart of a parent, can rise fast and fierce. He closed the distance between them with steps that carried the weight of both his fury and his fear. Mrs. Marbury turned at the sound of his approach. She didn't flinch. She didn't apologize or step aside. Instead, she regarded him with the cool indifference of someone who believed her actions were justified. "Your daughter needs structure, Mr. Grant. She has been manipulative and is falling behind. I am simply trying to correct her path." Those words struck him harder than any blow. He saw Lily's shoulders curl inward, her breath hitching, her eyes fixed on his boots rather than his face. She looked smaller than he had ever seen her. Michael's voice, when it came, was low and steady, but carrying enough force to fill the hallway. "Step away from my daughter. Now." For a long second, no one moved. The lights hummed overhead. A clock ticked at the end of the corridor. Then Mrs. Marbury hesitated, that brief pause revealing everything he needed to know. This was not the first time. This was a pattern. A secret hidden behind neat lesson plans and polite smiles during parent meetings. In one swift motion, Michael scooped Lily into his arms. Her small body shuddered against him, her arms gripping his neck with desperate relief. He did not look back at the woman who had frightened his child. He walked past the administrative office, through the double glass doors, and out into the afternoon sunlight that suddenly felt too bright for the truth he had just uncovered. He placed Lily gently into the truck, buckled her in, and saw her eyes finally meet his. There was fear there, yes, but also trust. A silent plea that he stay with her, protect her, fight for her. Michael reached for his phone. Whatever happened next would change everything. Michael sat there for a moment in the front seat of his truck, gripping the steering wheel as though it were the only solid thing left in a world that had just lurched sideways. Lily was quiet beside him, her small hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond the windshield. She did not cry. She had cried already, long before he arrived. Now she seemed too tired even for tears. The rage inside him pulsed like a heartbeat. Not wild, not reckless, but controlled in a way that only a man who has seen the darker corners of life can manage. Years ago, before Lily was born, before Emily had entered his world with her soft eyes and steady kindness, Michael would have reacted differently. The old version of himself would have stormed back into that building and made a mistake that could not be undone. But fatherhood had reshaped him. Grief had softened him. Love had anchored him. Still, there are moments when a man must choose whether to stand alone or call upon the people who shaped him long before quiet domestic mornings took the place of roaring engines. Michael knew exactly who he needed. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at a number he had not dialed in 8 long years. A number that once meant midnight rides, campfires flickering under desert skies, and promises made without hesitation. The Silver Ravens. His brothers. Men who had never asked him why he left, never resented his absence, never closed their doors when he walked away to raise his daughter alone. Brotherhood, real brotherhood, understood the seasons of a man's life. He pressed the call button. The phone rang only once before a familiar voice answered. It was a deep, gravelly voice edged with years of wind and road. "Michael." "That you?" He swallowed hard. "Willow Creek Academy. Bring everyone." There was no pause, no question, no judgment. Only 2 words spoken with complete certainty. 15 minutes. Michael hung up and let the phone rest in his lap. He turned slightly toward Lily, brushing a curl away from her face. Her eyes lifted to meet his, full of trembling confusion and the kind of hope that breaks a father's heart. "You are safe now. I promise. 15 minutes." It did not seem like much time, but for men who lived by their engines and their loyalties, it was an eternity. As the seconds crawled by, the small parking lot remained mostly still. A few parents walked toward the entrance, unaware of what had happened inside those quiet halls. A couple of teachers crossed the sidewalk, whispering about afternoon duties. Life moved on as though nothing had shifted, as though a little girl had not been cornered and chained only moments earlier. Then the sound came. A low rumble, at first rolling across the distant streets like a storm announcing itself on the horizon. It grew, deepened, and gathered strength until the entire ground seemed to tremble beneath it. The unmistakable harmony of engines riding together, each one carrying the thunder of the road. Lily's head lifted, her eyes widening. Michael felt something inside him loosen. Not relief exactly, but a recognition that he was no longer standing alone against a threat much greater than one cruel teacher. One by one, the motorcycles appeared at the end of the street. 20 riders in their worn leather vests, patches faded by years of sun and dust, riding in formation like an unspoken vow. These were not men of violence. They were men of loyalty. Men who had once called Michael brother and still meant it. The Silver Ravens pulled into the parking lot and lined their bikes with the kind of silent precision that spoke louder than any shouted promise. Children inside the school pressed their hands to the windows. Parents stepped back, startled. Teachers hesitated at the doors. Michael opened the truck door and stepped outside, the warm wind brushing against his face. The riders nodded to him, each acknowledging the bond that time had never fractured. He was no longer the man who had walked away from them. He was a father fighting for his child, and they were here to stand with him. The sudden presence of the Silver Ravens transformed the quiet school parking lot into something alive with tension and unspoken questions. Parents who had been chatting near their cars now found themselves frozen mid-sentence, their eyes shifting from the line of motorcycles to Michael, trying to understand what had brought 20 seasoned riders to an elementary school on an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Some stepped back, others stepped forward, but all of them watched. The Ravens didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their silence stood like a wall behind Michael, steady and unbreakable. Their weathered faces held the calm of men who had seen hardship before and knew exactly when to set aside everything to defend one of their own. It wasn't anger that radiated from them, but presence. A presence that said nothing harmful would happen to a child under their watch. Michael walked around to the passenger side and helped Lily step down from the truck. She held his hand tightly, her fingers curling into his palm as though afraid the world might pull her away again. The closest rider, Hawk Lawson, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and a gentle way of looking at children, took one glance at Lily's tear-streaked cheeks and inhaled slowly, grief crossing his features like a shadow from another lifetime. Somebody hurt her. His words were quiet but firm, carrying enough weight that every rider behind him straightened. Michael nodded. A teacher. And she's not the only one. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hawk placed a heavy hand on Michael's shoulder, a gesture that held more comfort than any spoken reassurance. We stand with you. That single sentence broke something open in the small crowd. A mother nearby, who had been watching her son fidget beside her, suddenly knelt and asked him softly if anything bad had ever happened in his class. The boy's face tightened, his eyes falling to the pavement. He gave a small, shaky nod. Another parent overheard and turned to her daughter, asking the same question. The little girl bit her lip, leaned close to her mother's ear, and whispered something that made the woman's face drain of color. One revelation led to another. Words tumbled out in hushed voices, children nervously tugging at sleeves or pressing themselves against their parents' sides. Pain that had been held in silence now spilled out into the warm afternoon air. Michael felt Lily shift beside him. She looked up at him, her brown eyes wide but no longer alone. Around them, stories unfolded. Not stories of scraped knees or playground disagreements, but of fear, punishments, shame. A cold voice telling children they were slow, careless, not enough. Helen Marbury had not been cruel to just one child. Helen had been cruel to many. A woman in her 30s, her hands trembling as she brushed hair from her son's forehead, spoke loudly enough for others to hear. I thought he was losing confidence. I thought it was just school pressure. But he's been scared for months. He just didn't know how to tell me. Her voice cracked and another parent stepped closer, offering comfort without judgment. A man on the far side of the lot clenched his fists as his daughter admitted through soft sobs that she had been locked in the reading room as punishment. His face crumpled with shock and grief. It was as if the presence of the silver ravens had given these families permission to say what had been too heavy to speak aloud. Parents turned toward Michael not because he had all the answers, but because he had stepped forward first. He had refused to pretend everything was fine, and his courage had opened the door for everyone else. Lily pressed herself closer to him, her voice quiet. "Daddy, were they scared too?" Michael brushed her hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart. They were scared too, but not anymore." In the span of only minutes, a single father's discovery had become a community awakening. What happened in that hallway was no longer a private wound. It was a truth stepping into the light. And truths once seen cannot be unseen. As the parking lot filled with uneasy murmurs and trembling voices, the school's stillness cracked open. What began as scattered whispers between individual parents grew into a current that swept across the entire space. It carried fear, but also relief, as though a long-held breath was finally being released. Mothers and fathers who had never spoken to one another beyond polite greetings now leaned close, exchanging stories that mirrored one another with heartbreaking precision. One parent described how her daughter had come home each afternoon with red eyes and claimed they were from allergies, though the girl had never suffered from them before. Another admitted that her son had become withdrawn, refusing to play outside or join the soccer team he once loved. Slowly they began to understand these had not been isolated struggles or worries. They were pieces of the same truth scattered among families who had been left to puzzle over them alone. A few steps away, a father lifted his small son into his arms, holding him close, as though to shield him from the memory of whatever he had endured. The boy buried his face in his father's shoulder, his small voice quivering. "She made me say things about myself. Bad things. Things that hurt." The father tightened his grip around the child, his eyes glistening with a mix of anguish and determination. "No one is going to hurt you again. Not ever." The weight of those words settled over the crowd. People who moments before had stood apart now formed a loose ring, united by something more powerful than fear. Michael stood with Lily still tucked against his side, the silver ravens forming a steady line behind him. Their presence didn't threaten. It steadied. It reminded every parent there that standing up was not only an option but a responsibility. A woman approached Michael hesitantly, her hands shaking slightly. She was a single mother named Amanda Cole, someone he had seen a few times at school events, but had never spoken to beyond a polite nod. Today her composure seemed held together by little more than hope. "My daughter has been acting different too. I kept telling myself it was just the new school year. But now hearing them, I don't think she felt safe. I didn't know who to talk to. I thought maybe I was overreacting." Michael met her gaze gently. "You're not overreacting. None of us are." Tears filled Amanda's eyes, though she blinked them back with the quiet strength of someone accustomed to handling life alone. She nodded, her shoulders trembling, yet her voice steadier than before. "Thank you for calling them. For not staying quiet." Michael didn't answer right away. The truth was, he hadn't acted out of bravery. He had acted out of love, out of instinct. Out of the simple, unavoidable need to protect the child he had promised to raise with every part of himself. Across the lot, Hawk Lawson stepped forward and addressed the gathering parents with a calm, resonant voice. "Folks, it's clear this isn't just one family's burden. If your children have been hurt, you've got the right to speak up. And you've got support here. No one stands alone today." The strength in his words rippled outward. Parents looked at one another, recognizing that the silence everyone's silence had allowed something harmful to grow in the shadows. Another mother stepped forward, then another, and another. Stories flowed. Wounds surfaced. And for the first time, instead of dismissing their own doubts, these parents faced the truth together. Lily's fingers tightened around Michael's hand. "Are they telling too?" "Yes, sweetheart. They are telling too." And in that moment, the community realized what had once been hidden behind classroom doors could no longer be ignored. What one child had suffered, many had suffered. And now the truth had found its voice. By late afternoon, the parking lot of Willow Creek Academy had shifted from uneasy murmurs to something more resolute. The parents stood shoulder to shoulder, each of them holding pieces of a puzzle they had never realized fit together. What they lacked in certainty, they carried in determination. For the first time, they were united not only by the safety of their children, but by the understanding that silence had allowed fear to take root far too long. The arrival of the police marked a turning point. 3 patrol cars rolled into the lot with lights flashing. The officers stepped out with calm expressions, sensing the fragile state of the crowd. The first officer to approach, a tall man with soft gray at his temples, greeted Michael with a nod as though he could read the anguish written across the father's face. "We'll need statements," he said gently, "from anyone willing to speak." Parents stepped forward immediately. Some carried anger, some carried pain, but all carried truth. One mother held her daughter's sketchbook, the pages torn and creased. She presented it with shaking hands, explaining how the drawings had once been her daughter's joy, only to become a source of punishment. Another father showed photos of bruises he had assumed came from playground roughhousing. Now he understood better. Too late, but still in time to speak. As officers listened, taking careful notes, the Silver Ravens stood in a steady line behind the families. They did not interfere. They did not raise their voices. They simply remained a visible sign that these parents were not alone, a quiet shield that wrapped the group in reassurance. Inside the building, Principal Robert Langford hesitated in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. His face was pale. He knew the moment he saw the patrol cars and the gathering parents that whatever had been brewing beneath his school's polished image had finally surfaced. He stepped outside with tentative steps, hands raised slightly as though warding off a wave. "Let's discuss this privately. We can schedule meetings," he began, but his voice faltered when a group of parents turned toward him, their expressions firm. One mother stepped forward. "Meetings won't fix what you ignored." Another added, "We came to you. You didn't listen." Principal Langford's gaze darted toward the officers, then toward Michael, then to the row of bikers standing behind the families. His voice wavered. "We'll handle this through the proper channels." A father's voice rose sharply above the murmuring crowd. "Proper channels failed our children." The officer nearest him nodded slightly, acknowledging the truth without speaking it aloud. The parents had not just been unheard. They had been dismissed. He turned to Michael. "We're requesting access to the school's security footage. Hallway cameras, classroom entries, common areas." Michael nodded once, his jaw tight. Principal Langford started to protest, but the officer's clear, calm tone cut him off. "Sir, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. But we are doing it." That was the moment everything broke open. A second officer retrieved the keys from the administrative office, and within minutes, they were inside the small security room behind the main hallway. The monitors flickered to life, showing grainy black and white footage. Timestamps scrolled along the bottom. Detective Karen O'Neill, a seasoned child protection investigator with steady eyes and a quiet voice, arrived shortly after. She reviewed the first few clips silently, her expression tightening as the scenes unfolded. There on one screen, Mrs. Helen Marbury dragged a young boy down the hallway by his arm. On another, she stood over a trembling girl pressed into a corner. In clip after clip, the same cold posture, the same harsh gestures, the same predatory sense of timing. The officers exchanged glances. Parents behind them gasped softly, some covering their mouths as the evidence of what their children had endured appeared right before their eyes. Detective O'Neill finally exhaled. "This isn't discipline. This is patterned behavior. And it's been happening for months." A hush fell over the group as the weight of her words settled. Lily squeezed Michael's hand tightly. "Daddy, are they going to stop her?" Michael knelt beside his daughter, brushing her curls gently. "Yes, sweetheart. They're going to stop her. And they're never going to let her hurt anyone again." Outside the small room, the late afternoon sun began to sink behind the school's brick walls. But inside, the truth was no longer hiding in shadows. It was on every screen, visible to anyone willing to look. The silence that followed was not one of fear. It was the silence before justice begins to move. Over the next several days, Willow Creek Academy was transformed from a place of routine and quiet routines into the center of an unfolding truth that no one in Cedar Glen could ignore any longer. Patrol cars came and went. Detectives carried notebooks, printed screenshots, and carefully labeled evidence folders. Parents arrived with hesitant steps and left with heavy hearts. And children once silent now found themselves being gently asked questions they had long feared to answer. Detective Karen O'Neill worked tirelessly, moving methodically through hallway cameras, classroom transitions, and the narrow spaces where children passed without adults noticing. She had spent more than a decade uncovering the kinds of stories people never wanted to imagine happening to children. Yet some clips still made her pause, her eyes closing for a measured breath before she continued. One morning, she invited Michael to sit outside the small room where interviews were being held. Lily was inside with a child psychologist, a warm, spirited woman who knelt to the level of every child she met. From the hallway, Michael could hear quiet questions spoken with gentle care, the sort of voice meant to coax trust from frightened hearts. Lily's answers came in soft fragments, words stumbling at first, then gaining the courage that comes when a child feels heard, perhaps for the first time. Rosa, who had come to support them both, sat beside Michael. Her hands, always so sure and steady, trembled slightly as she held a warm cup of tea between her palms. She glanced at him with worried eyes. Children should never have to explain fear like this. Not at their age. Michael nodded. His voice felt lodged deep in his chest. She held this inside for months. I should have seen it sooner. Rosa gently placed her hand on his arm. You saw it the moment she needed you to. That is what matters now. A few minutes later, Lily emerged from the interview room, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm. She looked tired but lighter somehow, as though speaking had eased a weight she had carried alone far too long. She climbed into her father's lap without a word, resting her head against his chest. Michael wrapped his arms around her, feeling her heartbeat settle into a calmer rhythm. Meanwhile, other children and parents began to share their stories with the investigators. Many were hesitant at first, unsure whether their experiences were important enough to mention. But the officers listened attentively, their patience allowing each child to step carefully from silence into truth. Emma, a quiet girl from Lily's class, explained how Mrs. Marbury had forced her to stand in a corner for nearly an entire afternoon because she misspelled a word. Marcus, a soft-spoken boy whose mother arrived each day straight from her job at the diner, whispered that he had been told his father would be disappointed in him if he didn't say he was slow. Lily's friend Aaron came forward too, explaining how he had been denied lunch for talking during reading time. Each story, when spoken alone, was painful, but together they formed a picture of something carefully hidden, something that had festered under the trust of a community that believed its children were safe inside those bright brick walls. One afternoon, as Detective O'Neill reviewed the accumulating evidence, she spoke quietly to Michael. These children have endured more than anyone realized, but your daughter was the one who opened the door for us to see the truth. You should be proud of her courage. Michael looked over at Lily, drawing in her coloring book while Rosa watched her. Pride was too small a word for what he felt. His daughter had endured fear, silence, and humiliation, yet she still found the strength to draw bright gardens and gentle birds. She was fragile and resilient at the same time, a combination that would carry her further than she knew. Outside, the schoolyard remained strangely quiet. The swings barely moved, the slides sat untouched, and laughter had been replaced by the steady presence of truth making its way into the world. Change was coming. Not quickly, not easily, but certainly. For now, the town of Cedar Glen waited. But the waiting was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with resolve, because the children were speaking. The truth was blooming, and just as slow as it sometimes moves was already on its way. As the investigation deepened, the walls of Willow Creek Academy seemed to carry a heaviness that no amount of sunshine could lift. For years, the school had possessed a reputation for excellence, a place where parents felt secure dropping their children each morning. But reputations can mask truths, and behind the polished bulletin boards and neatly trimmed hedges lay a pattern of silence that had harmed far too many. One afternoon, when most of the classroom sat empty and investigators moved quietly through the halls, a woman in her 50s approached the school's entrance. She walked with deliberate steps, clutching a folder against her chest. Her name was Miss Carol Watkins, a longtime teacher whose gentle manner had always endeared her to students. Though her hair had begun to gray, her eyes still held kindness in its purest form. Yet today, they shone with something else. A weary sorrow. She paused in the doorway before approaching Detective O'Neill. "I heard you're still gathering testimony," she said softly. "I have something to share." Detective O'Neill offered a seat, her expression encouraging but calm. "Please take your time, Miss." Watkins sat down, folding her hands in her lap. For a moment she stared at the folder. She carried her fingers tightening as though summoning the strength to open a chapter she had hoped was behind her. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled despite her composure. "I reported Helen once. Last year. I saw her gripping a child's arm in the hallway. The child was crying and she told him to stop being dramatic. He couldn't have been more than 7. Detective O'Neill leaned forward. "What happened after you reported it, Miss?" Watkins let out a breath that had lived in her for far too long. "I went straight to Principal Langford. I wrote everything down. I asked for an investigation. He told me Helen was a respected educator who used firm but effective methods. He said I was misinterpreting normal discipline. He told me to focus on my own classroom." She reached into the folder and pulled out a thin stack of papers held together by a rusted staple. "These are the reports I filed. They were never followed up on." As she handed them over, her eyes glistened. "I knew something wasn't right. I tried to speak. But when your voice is dismissed like that, you begin to doubt your own instincts. You begin to wonder if you're being too sensitive." Detective O'Neill flipped gently through the pages. The dates, the descriptions, the written pleas for intervention. All ignored. All dismissed. All signs smothered beneath the desire to protect the school's reputation rather than the children inside it. Michael, who had been standing near the doorway, listened with a tightening jaw. Behind him, Hawk Lawson shifted his weight, a quiet frustration settling across his features. "Miss," Watkins glanced toward them with an apologetic sorrow, as though she felt responsible for something no single person should have been expected to fix alone. "I wish I had pushed harder," she whispered. "I wish I had done more." Michael stepped forward with steady calm. "You tried. The ones who failed these children weren't the ones who spoke up. They were the ones who didn't listen." Her eyes widened, slightly surprised by the kindness in his voice. She nodded once, her breath trembling. "Thank you." Detective O'Neill placed a reassuring hand on the teacher's arm. "Your testimony is important. You were the first to see what others refused to see, and now your courage will help make sure this never happens again." As Miss Watkins left the room, the late afternoon sun caught the rim of her glasses, giving her a quiet glow that Michael could not help but notice. She carried guilt, yes, but also a dignity that comes from choosing truth even when the world refuses to hear it. That evening, when Detective O'Neill added Miss Watkins's report to the growing file, the story of Willow Creek Academy shifted again. Not only because the abuse had been uncovered, but because it became clear the warning signs had been there all along. They had simply been buried beneath the kind of silence that harms the most vulnerable. And now that silence had been broken. News travels quickly in a small town, and by the time the investigation at Willow Creek Academy reached its second week, whispers had grown into full conversations across Cedar Glen. At coffee shops, grocery aisles, and front porches, people wondered how such harm could have lived for so long behind the familiar brick walls of a place they trusted. But as the truth gained ground, another force began to rise as well. Resistance. It started quietly with small remarks from people who believed Mrs. Helen Marbury was incapable of wrongdoing. She had been part of the school for over 20 years, often praised for her stern but efficient methods. Some parents liked that she demanded discipline, even admired her sharp standards. A few insisted that children sometimes exaggerated. Others felt their own pride shaken and preferred to believe no real harm had occurred at all. And then came the hired storm. One crisp morning, as Michael walked Lily into the temporary counseling office set up by the school district, he noticed a man standing near the entrance, in a navy suit that did not match the humble character of Cedar Glen. His polished shoes caught the sunlight, and a stack of folders rested beneath his arm. The man moved with an air of confidence that suggested he was used to bending situations in his favor. Later, Michael would learn his name was David Brennan, a defense attorney from the city known for taking difficult cases and turning them inside out. He began meeting with the school board almost immediately. Within days, the narrative around Mrs. Marbury started to shift in certain circles. A small but vocal group of supporters claimed she was being punished for holding students to higher standards. Brennan released a short statement to the local paper, claiming that some parents were overreacting, that the children involved were easily influenced, and that too many people were rushing to judgment based on incomplete information. The words were carefully chosen, but their intent was clear. Cast doubt. Question motives. Undermine the wounded. Michael felt the ripple of that doubt even before it reached him directly. Parents who had once shared concern now avoided eye contact. A few whispered that the Silver Ravens showing up had turned the situation into something bigger and louder than it needed to be. One man even suggested that Michael had brought trouble onto himself by involving bikers. But Michael stayed steady. He did not raise his voice. He did not defend his reputation. He let the truth stand where it needed to stand. Yet beneath that calm, he could feel the old version of himself stirring the part that once fought hard on dusty roads and believed loyalty mattered more than convenience. A few days later, Brennan's first official press conference took place on the courthouse steps. The small crowd gathered, reporters adjusting microphones, townsfolk lingering out of curiosity. Michael kept his distance, standing across the street with Hawk and a few other riders. Lily stayed home with Rosa, far from the noise that threatened to twist her story. Brennan stepped forward, his smile measured. Mrs. Marbury is a seasoned educator with decades of dedicated service. These accusations arise during a time when discipline in schools is under attack. We intend to show that many of these claims were influenced, exaggerated, or even coached. Some families, he continued, have motives that are not entirely pure. He paused deliberately. A father with a complicated past has stirred up a great deal of emotion, perhaps intentionally. Hawk took a slow breath beside Michael. They're coming after you now, brother. Michael's jaw tightened, but he kept his arms folded. Let them talk. The truth won't break. But Brennan wasn't finished. He leaned toward the microphones. We will also show that the presence of a motorcycle group at the school created an atmosphere of intimidation, clouding honest testimony. A soft murmur moved through the crowd. Hawk stepped closer. They're twisting this, Michael. Trying to scare folks off. Michael nodded, though his eyes stayed fixed on Brennan. They can try, but I know what I saw. And so does Lily. Across the street, the lawyer continued painting a picture designed to confuse, to divide, to weaken the unity that had begun forming around the families. His confidence suggested he had no doubt in his ability to turn the case into a battle of reputation rather than truth. But Michael had something Brennan didn't. He had courage born of love and brothers who stood with him not for glory, but because the safety of a child was something sacred. The storm had begun, but Michael was steady, and he would not step back. The courtroom battle had barely begun when the weight of David Brennan's strategy became painfully clear. His team worked swiftly, sending letters to the district office requesting old disciplinary files, medical records, and any scrap of information that might cast doubt on the families stepping forward. Meanwhile, whispers in the community grew sharper, hinting at motives that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with fear. Fear of lawsuits. Fear of scandal. Fear of admitting that the school they trusted had failed its children so completely. But there was one thing: Brennan had underestimated the strength of the evidence. Detective Karen O'Neill and her team moved with steady diligence. Their investigation was not built on emotion or rumor. It was built on something far more powerful. Facts. Documents. Medical assessments. Video clips. Patterns no reasonable person could deny. Every piece of evidence was handled as if it were the heartbeat of a child relying on justice to speak when they could not. One morning, Michael sat in a small conference room alongside other parents as investigators carefully laid out printed photos taken from the hallway footage. The images were grainy but clear enough. In each one, Mrs. Marbury's posture spoke louder than any accusation. Her fingers gripped small arms. Her voice, though absent in the silent recordings, seemed to inhabit the frames through the shrinking expressions of the children she confronted. A mother sitting beside Michael pressed her hands to her mouth, tears gathering in her eyes. "I didn't want to believe it was this bad," she whispered. "I thought maybe I misunderstood my daughter's fear. But this was real." Hawk Lawson, sitting in the back of the room with a few other silver ravens, leaned forward slightly. "No child should ever look that small," he murmured, his voice unexpectedly soft. Detective O'Neill stepped to the front. "This is only part of what we found. There are 17 documented incidents spanning 3 months. Some more severe than others, but all part of a clear pattern." She targeted children she believed would stay silent. The parents exchanged glances, each one understanding that their individual worries had been pieces of a much larger cruelty. They hadn't been imagining things. They hadn't been overreacting. Their children had been hurt. The next layer of evidence came from medical professionals. Pediatricians and child psychologists submitted written evaluations describing symptoms of emotional trauma, anxiety, regression, nightmares, behavioral shifts that aligned directly with the timeline of Mrs. Marbury's class. These weren't impressions. They were diagnoses. A doctor who had treated 3 of the affected children provided a recorded statement. "These injuries are consistent with an adult grip. These emotional responses are consistent with targeted psychological harm. Children do not manifest these patterns without cause." When the recording ended, silence fell over the room. Even the toughest of the ravens lowered their gazes. Michael felt a slow ache rise in him, a mixture of sorrow and fury. Lily had endured this quietly, gently, without letting it spill onto him in nightly sobs or frantic explanations. She had carried her fear with such quiet dignity that it made his chest tighten. He thought of Emily, of how fiercely she had loved their daughter. He felt the echo of her strength settle into him. She would have fought for Lily, too. She would have stood exactly where he now stood. In the hallway outside, one officer spoke quietly to another. "If Brennan wants to twist this case, he's going to have a hard time. Cameras don't lie." Detective O'Neill closed her folder. "We're presenting all of this to the district attorney tomorrow. Once charges are filed, the case will move forward quickly. I want you all to know something. What happened here is not your fault. And your willingness to speak has made all the difference for these children." As the parents gathered their things, Michael lingered near the door. Hawk approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You opened the first door, brother. And look how many walked through it." Michael didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked down the hall where Lily sat coloring in a waiting room chair, her small feet swinging back and forth. She looked fragile and strong at the same time, like a flower that had grown through concrete. This fight wasn't about reputation, or pride, or the past Brennan tried to use against him. It was about a child's right to be safe, and no lawyer in the world could argue that away. The morning of the preliminary hearings arrived with a cool wind drifting across Cedar Glen, the kind of breeze that carries both anticipation and unease. Families gathered outside the courthouse in small clusters, their voices low, their children kept close. Michael stood near the steps with Lily's hand wrapped firmly in his. She wasn't going inside today. Rosa had come along to take her to the park once things began, keeping her far from the tension of the courtroom. Still, Lily wanted to see her father before he walked inside, wanted to give him the quiet courage she carried in her small, steady heart. "You'll be here when I get back?" she asked, her voice soft. "Always," he replied, brushing a curl from her forehead. "No matter what." She nodded, holding him for a long moment before Rosa gently guided her toward the bench near the walkway. Michael watched them go, feeling something inside him steady. Across the plaza, the silver ravens stood like a silent wall, their leather vests catching the early light. They didn't posture or glare. They simply remained present, hands, folded shoulders, squared, each one bearing the calm of men who understood loyalty in its truest form. Their presence carried weight but also comfort. A reminder that the families walking into the courthouse did not have to face the storm alone. When the doors opened, the parents stepped inside together. A few held binders filled with documents and photos. Others carried nothing but their resolve. Michael walked at the center of the group, his jaw set, the echo of Lily's small fingers still lingering in his palm. Inside, the courtroom felt colder than the air outside, its fluorescent lights casting a quiet tension across polished wood benches. At the front of the room stood the prosecution's table, neatly organized with files and carefully labeled evidence. Across from it sat David Brennan and his team, their expressions confident, their suits perfectly pressed. Brennan looked up as Michael entered, offering a polite nod that carried a sharp edge beneath its courtesy. It was the kind of gesture meant to unsettle. But Michael wasn't shaken. He had lived through loss so deep it reshaped his soul. A lawyer's smirk couldn't stir that kind of fear. As families took their seats, Brennan rose for his initial statement. His voice carried the smooth, practiced tone of someone used to controlling rooms. These accusations, while emotionally charged, must be examined with caution. Children are impressionable. Parents, understandably distressed, may interpret minor disciplinary actions as cruelty. And given certain individuals with complicated histories, it is possible that narratives have been influenced or exaggerated. Hawk leaned toward Michael, whispering, "Complicated history." "That's how he puts it." Michael kept his gaze forward. "Let him try." The prosecutor, a composed woman named Jennifer Price, rose in response. Her tone was not flashy or theatrical. It was steady, firm, almost maternal. "What we have here is not confusion, not exaggeration. We have 17 separate incidents captured on school security footage. We have medical reports confirming physical harm. We have psychological evaluations documenting trauma, consistent with targeted emotional abuse. And we have these families whose testimonies align not because of influence, but because they endured the same pattern of cruelty." She placed a hand on a thick folder. "The evidence will speak clearly, much more clearly than speculation or character attacks." Brennan's jaw tightened, the first sign that his confidence had a crack in it. The first clip played on a screen above the judge's bench. The black and white hallway came into view, the timestamp blinking quietly in the corner. A child flinched as Mrs. Marbury grabbed his wrist. The room grew impossibly still. A mother in the front row covered her mouth. Another father reached for his wife's hand. Even from the back, the ravens seemed to inhale as one. The footage continued. Clip after clip. Child after child. The truth laid bare. When the screen finally dimmed, he could feel the heaviness settle like a blanket made of stone. The judge exhaled slowly. "There is sufficient cause to proceed with full charges." Brennan rose again, trying to recover ground, but his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. "Objection, Your Honor. These clips lack full context." The judge raised her hand. "The context is clear enough." A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Michael felt Hawk clap a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's moving now, brother. The truth has its boots on." Michael nodded, eyes fixed ahead. This hearing wasn't victory yet, but it was the beginning. The tide had turned. The truth, Lily's truth, the other children's truth, was finally stepping into a place where it could not be buried again. What started with one frightened little girl in a hallway was now unfolding into something larger than any one family. Justice had begun its long, steady walk. Once the full charges were approved, Michael wasted no time making the decision he knew deep in his heart was necessary. He could not allow Lily to return to Willow Creek Academy, not even for a single day. The hallways that had once seemed bright and safe now carried memories he wished she would never have to face again. Memories no child should carry, especially a gentle little girl who had spent her early years clinging to the scraps of comfort left after losing her mother. He withdrew her from the school the very next morning. The paperwork was quick, though the principal's office felt colder than he remembered. Principal Langford offered stiff apologies that did not reach his eyes, muttering about ongoing procedures and district protocols. Michael nodded politely, but didn't linger. There was nothing more to be said between them. Not after everything. With Lily's hand in his, Michael walked her out the front doors and into the cool autumn air. Leaves brushed across the sidewalk in quiet rustles as though urging them forward toward something better. For 2 days, Michael visited schools across the county. Some were too crowded. Some too rigid. Some had the same strictness that now made his heart tighten. But on the third morning, he stepped onto the grounds of Meadowbrook Elementary, a smaller school tucked between 2 large oak trees whose branches arched over the walkway like welcoming arms. The moment he walked inside, something felt different. The office smelled faintly of crayons and warm coffee. The bulletin boards held artwork taped with joyful abandon, not trimmed edges of perfect cutouts. And there behind the counter stood Principal Laura Whitfield, a woman with soft eyes and a voice that carried genuine concern instead of rehearsed politeness. Michael explained why he was there. He didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He simply told the truth. Her face tightened with empathy rather than discomfort. "Let me meet her," she said. "Let me make sure she feels safe here." When Lily stepped into the office, still clutching her stuffed rabbit for courage, Principal Whitfield knelt down so their faces were level. "Hi there, Lily. I'm Laura. I'm very glad you're here. And I want you to know something. If you ever feel scared or uncomfortable for any reason at all, you can come right here to my office without asking permission. My door is always open to you." Lily blinked, surprised. Her voice wavered. Every day, the principal replied with a gentle smile. That small exchange was enough to ease something inside Michael that had stayed wound tight for weeks. Lily looked up at him, a whisper of hope flickering behind her eyes. Her first day at Meadowbrook was cautious but promising. Michael walked her to her classroom where Mrs. Allison Parker, her new teacher, greeted her with a warm grin. She asked about the rabbit, complimented Lily's hair, and showed her the corner of the room where students kept their art supplies. There was no rush, no forced cheer, just kindness. Michael stood outside the classroom door for nearly 5 minutes after Lily had taken her seat, listening to her faint voice chatting shyly with a girl named Sophie, who slid a handful of colored pencils toward her with a bright smile. Something inside him eased for the first time in a long while. That afternoon, when Michael returned to pick her up, Lily came skipping down the sidewalk holding a drawing she had made in class. It was a garden filled with bright flowers, tall grass, and a small family of 3 standing together beneath the sky. She held it out proudly. "Daddy, I made a friend today. Her name is Sophie. She likes drawing too." Michael knelt down and pulled her into a hug. He felt her small arms wrap around his shoulders with a strength that told him healing had already begun. Across town, other families were taking their own steps toward recovery. Emma began therapy sessions twice a week. Marcus regained small pieces of confidence each morning. Lily's friend Aaron joined an after-school reading program that made him smile again. But the greatest transformation was happening quietly in Lily's gentle heart. Each day she let the world in a little more. Each day she reclaimed a piece of herself she'd been forced to hide. In a town shaken by betrayal, the children were becoming symbols of resilience. And Lily, with her coloring pages and her hopeful eyes, was leading them more than she knew. The Silver Ravens had always been known in Cedar Glen as men of the roadmen who kept to themselves unless the world called upon them. People saw the leather vests, the engines, the weathered faces, and made quiet assumptions. But the events at Willow Creek Academy changed the way the town saw them, and in a deeper way changed how they saw themselves. From the moment charges were filed against Mrs. Marbury, the Ravens committed to protecting the families with a steadiness that felt almost sacred. They attended every hearing, every procedural motion, every meeting where parents needed reassurance that they weren't alone. Their presence wasn't loud or intimidating. It was comforting, solid, a backdrop of unwavering support. At the courthouse, they occupied the last row or stood along the wall, arms crossed, hats tucked respectfully under their arms. Whenever a parent stepped up to testify or give a statement, The ravens straightened their backs as though lending strength across the room. Michael saw the effect it had. Parents who once trembled when speaking now stood taller, their voices steadier. Even the children sensed it. When Emma had to return to the courthouse for a final evaluation meeting, she held Hawk Lawson's hand as they walked through the doors. He didn't say much, only told her he liked her sky blue backpack and that she was brave. But the way the little girl smiled told Michael all he needed to know. The ravens also stepped in quietly but powerfully to help the families heal. They organized poker runs and charity rides, transforming their love of the open road into fundraising events that brought in more money than anyone expected. Riders from neighboring towns joined, creating long rivers of motorcycles that wound through the hills like a moving promise. People lined the streets to watch them roar past, their engines echoing through the valley. Every dollar raised went straight to the families. Therapy sessions, transportation, school supplies, medical appointments. Nothing was withheld. Nothing was questioned. If a family needed help, the ravens found a way. One evening at a community meeting inside the old parish hall, Hawk stood before the crowd and shared something he had held quietly for years. His voice, usually steady and measured, wavered just slightly. "My daughter was in Helen's class 5 years ago. She never told me what happened until she was old enough to leave home. I asked the school back then if something was wrong. They told me everything was fine. They told me she was sensitive. They told me she needed to toughen up." His eyes lowered, the weight of regret hanging in the silence that followed. "I should have pushed harder. I should have trusted my instincts over anyone else's words. I won't make that mistake again. And I won't let any of you make it alone." The room grew quiet. Parents listened with a depth of understanding that only comes from shared wounds. Michael felt something shift in that moment. Hawk wasn't just standing with him. He was healing a part of himself, too. The ravens didn't stop at fundraising. They helped build a network for families who didn't know where to turn. They created rides to escort children to new schools on their first days, giving them a sense of protection and pride. They delivered meals to overwhelmed parents. They visited homes, offering company to those drowning in guilt or confusion. And in the smallest, simplest acts, they showed that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes strength was showing up, over and over again. As Lily healed, Michael noticed her becoming curious about the motorcycles she once saw only as relics from his past. One afternoon, she even asked Hawk why he wore a patch with a silver bird on it. Hawk smiled, tapping the emblem lightly. "Because we believe in lifting people up, especially the ones who don't know they can fly yet." Lily considered this with her thoughtful little frown, then nodded as though she understood. And maybe she did. Maybe children understand certain truths faster than grown folk expect. Gradually, Cedar Glen began to see the ravens differently. Not as rough riders or remnants of a wild past, but as men who believed in protecting the innocent. Men whose hearts were as steady as the rumble of their engines. And Michael saw something else. Something deeper. He had never truly left the Brotherhood. He had simply brought it somewhere it had never been needed more. 6 months after the courtroom doors closed on the final verdict, Cedar Glen was no longer the same quiet town it had been before the truth at Willow Creek Academy came to light. The changes did not arrive with fanfare or celebration. They came quietly through new policies taped to school office walls, through meetings where administrators no longer brushed aside concerns, and through the steady presence of child advocates who listened before they ever spoke. The community had been shaken hard, but it had learned something vital: silence protects no one, especially not the smallest among us. The district placed Principal Langford on immediate leave. Investigations revealed that he had not only dismissed earlier reports, but had filed them away in drawers that hadn't seen daylight in years. 2 assistant principals resigned soon after, unable to explain why they ignored concerns raised by teachers and families. New leadership stepped in, people who believed that safeguarding children mattered more than preserving reputations. Training programs rolled out countywide. Teachers sat through workshops that taught them not just how to recognize signs of harm, but how to act with urgency and compassion. Complaint procedures were rewritten so that no one's voice could be tucked away and forgotten. Security footage retention was extended to half a year. And for the first time, parents were invited to serve on oversight panels, giving them a voice that could not be brushed aside. But the person who changed the most was Lily. Michael watched her grow stronger each day, more sure of herself, more confident in the simple joy of being a child again. Her laughter had returned, not the quiet, careful kind she once carried, but the bright, bubbling sound that once filled their home when Emily was still alive. That sound brought memories with it, tender ones that sat gently on Michael's heart. Emily had loved hearing Lily laugh. And now somehow in all the healing it felt as though a piece of Emily had found its way back into their home. At Meadowbrook Elementary, Lily thrived. Her artwork hung proudly on classroom walls, and she often came home with paint on her sleeves and a sparkle in her eyes. Her teacher, Mrs. Parker, adored her, praising her imagination and her thoughtful spirit. Lily talked about school again, about friends and stories and little triumphs that made each day brighter. She spoke openly now, without fear of saying the wrong thing, without shrinking her voice to avoid notice. Even on the nights when she woke from a bad dream and whispered that she still remembered the old classroom, Michael sat beside her until she drifted back to sleep. Healing wasn't a straight road, he knew, but Lily was walking it bravely, step by steady step. And then came the quiet afternoon when Michael decided it was time to give her something special. A reminder of her strength. A gift tied to both her mother's memory and his own transformation. In the garage, over the course of 3 patient months, he built a sky blue motorcycle sized perfectly for a young rider. Not a toy. A real bike, scaled down, crafted with the same care he once gave to the custom machines of his past life. On the gas tank he painted her name, Lily Grant. And beneath it, in tiny letters tucked into the curve of the metal, he wrote something only they would understand. Emily's girl. The day he unveiled it, Lily's eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and joy that washed over her like sunlight. She ran her hand gently along the paint, her small fingers tracing the lettering. Is it really mine? Michael smiled. Every bit of it. Teaching her to ride brought a kind of joy he hadn't known he still carried. They practiced in the backyard first, her tiny helmet bobbing as she learned balance and control. He taught her the same lessons he learned from his own father long ago. Respect the machine. Know its power. Feel its rhythm. Trust yourself. When she finally rode down their quiet street with the autumn wind sweeping her curls back and a smile bright enough to light the whole neighborhood, Michael felt something lift inside him. Something heavy that had rested there for years. His little girl was free. Not just from fear or memories or the shadows of a cruel teacher. She was free in her heart. Free to explore, to grow, to laugh without restraint. Free to live the kind of childhood Emily would have wanted for her. As Lily rode, the silver ravens pulled up quietly at the end of the street, engines rumbling low. They didn't crowd her. They didn't cheer loudly. They simply watched with pride as a small girl on a sky blue motorcycle rode past them like a symbol of everything they had fought to protect. Hawk removed his helmet and wiped his eyes, pretending the wind had made them water. That girl is going to move mountains someday, he said softly. Michael nodded. She already has. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and Lily helped him wipe down the bike, she looked up with her warm brown eyes and asked a question that made him pause. Daddy, am I brave? He knelt down, cupping her face gently. You are the bravest person I know. The bravest person he knew, and the reason dozens of families found their voices. The reason a broken system had been forced to change. The reason silence no longer ruled a school that once hid its darkest secrets. As twilight settled over Cedar Glen, Michael felt a peace he hadn't known in years. Emily's memory felt close, as though she were standing just behind him, watching their daughter glow in the light of a future she fought hard to reclaim. This story didn't end with a courtroom or a sentence. It ended in the steady heartbeat of a community choosing to protect its children. It ended with a father rediscovering his strength of brotherhood, proving loyalty meant standing beside the vulnerable, and a little girl reclaiming her courage one bright day at a time. And for anyone listening tonight, whether you are a parent, a grandparent, or someone who simply cares about the safety of children, let this story remind you that true change begins when even one person refuses to stay silent. If this touched your heart, please share your thoughts below. And if you believe every child deserves safety, kindness, and a voice that will never be dismissed, like the video and subscribe for more stories of courage, community, and hope. Thank you for listening.